We're live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association's Facebook page and our series of Meet the Experts. In just a few minutes, I will have joining me on screen all the way from India, Dr. Hisham Ahamed, I always mispronounce names, I'm so sorry, to discuss with us hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and its treatment and management in India. And while that might seem a far stretch for our American-based organization, it's important to recognize that the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association has clients in 43 countries around the world, and many of them located in India. So we're very happy to have a colleague in India that can take quality care of our patients with HCM. So without further ado, you're all joining us right now. I'm going to share my screen and say, welcome, doctor, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your program all the way over there in India?
Hi, Lisa. Good to be with you as always. It's evening here in India. It's 11:30 p.m., so I guess it's good evening, everyone. So as Lisa mentioned, my name is Dr. Hisham Ahamed. I'm the consultant cardiologist at the Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences, Kochi. And we're really down south in India, the southernmost state in India. And in our institute, at the Amrita Institute, we've initiated a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy care program since mid-2014, and wherein we have focused on the multiple spheres of care for every HCM patient. And I think I'm happy to say that we've made some confident strides in the last couple of years. And we would like to think that we've made a very good beginning.
Well, I am very happy with what I've learned about your program so far. And I will say that while we've communicated on a couple of patients in the past, our first opportunity to meet was at the International Summit on Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy, chaired by the Drs. Marin. And we were both on faculty there. And you made me cry. It doesn't happen very easily, but you did. But we'll talk more about that in a moment because it's really hard to do. So tell us a little bit about the structure of the program and how the program came to be in your...
Right. Yeah. So the beginnings of the program, excuse me, 14, as I mentioned. And we had the elements of an HCM program in place, but we've never had integrated them to be a very efficient system. So we had the departments of electrophysiology, we had heart failure and transplant units. So we had clinical cardiology, and we had a very big cardiac imaging section as well. But we never really linked them to perform as one unit to lay the foundations for an HCM care unit. So the population of our country, as you know, is 1 billion, and it's still growing. And the population of our state is something like 33 million. So if you do the math, and if you look at the 1 in 200 prevalence of HCM patients, you're looking at a lot of HCM patients in the country and in our home state. So we wanted to build a model in which we wanted to deliver standard of care, what any patient would otherwise receive in the best HCM centers in the world. And we wanted to emulate the best centers. And that's how we began to link each of these spheres. We began to link electrophysiology, cardiac imaging, clinical cardiology, heart failure and transplant. And we wanted to build this on a foundation of clinical genetics and counseling and patient counseling services. So we've sort of formed the seeds of the unit in mid-2014. We wanted to see how we would get there from that point onwards. And these were the foundations that we laid. And over the last couple of years, our HCM registry has grown to approximately 660 patients, a lot of HCM families in there. And one of the biggest additions for us, and probably one of the biggest impact changing moments for us, was the joining of a surgeon who was trained in myectomies. And there are hardly any surgeons in the entire nation who's well trained in septal myectomies. And that proved to be the real game changer for us.
So without naming names, we had a woman contact us regarding a family member who was really doing poorly with his HCM, and this was last fall, and I had just basically gotten up to speed on the program that you were running, and we made that referral. And from what I understand at this point, he was evaluated, needing myectomy, had his surgery, has a device, and he is now like big champion of the HCM program over there in India. And it's one of these stories where the world is a lot smaller than we think. And our communication was able to facilitate a very prompt evaluation, and his care was almost record-setting in terms of how quick, once he found out about you, we got everything up and running. So it is a testament to the system that you built to be able to respond so quickly to the needs of somebody who was so in need of care at that point in time. So congratulations on the structure, the model, the patient throughput that you've had in this short period of time from 2014 to date. It's to truly be commended, and it is so desperately needed in such a large country. And there's been enough study about genetics and HCM. But why don't you tell us what's really interesting about the Indian population and genetics and HCM?
Right. So, yeah, so it was sort of an unexplored territory, so to speak. So we had a lot of genetic data internationally. International databases are full of genetic data, as you mentioned, in HCM. So when we set out to form the HCM unit, and when our genetics arm got really functional, we were beginning to see mutations which were traditionally described and which were consistent with the international database. We also began to see mutations called myosin binding protein C mutations, which were traditionally considered to be more common in Southeast Asians. So that's one area that we did begin to see. We also began to see some new mutations, probably not that commonly described in the general population, general HCM population worldwide. And some of these mutations have been associated with a very malignant history of sudden cardiac death. So we've had mutations on both sides of the spectrum. We've had very common ones, we've had relatively new ones or rare ones, and we've had ones of unknown significance. So I guess we're moving along the same evolutionary journey which every new HCM unit has to go through.
I think there's going to be a lot of exciting news coming out of your work, because it is an untouched population, and maybe we will learn where some of these genetic mutations are hiding. And I think you're going to be able to teach us a great deal going forward. So obviously you're interested in genetic research. Are there other aspects of research that your program is looking into at this point?
Yes, genetic research is really, as you mentioned, it's one of the prime areas that we are really focusing on. And we would also like to sort of, to find the common ground between the clinical phenotype and the genotype in the Indian population. So we would really want to know, in terms of research, to know how the Indian cohort of patients actually do in contrast to the published data of HCM internationally. So genetics is one, clinical genetic phenotype, genotype correlation is another area that we're closely looking at, especially in this population, which has not been studied that commonly. We're also looking into our cohort in terms of a lot of patients who come with the phenotype of HCM. They have a lot of hypertrophy, but they're not really HCM. And I can tell you, in our cohort, we have a substantial group of patients who have been referred to as, or who have been followed up as HCM for many, many years. And we've had the good fortune of our genetics arm to really prove that it's a phenocopy, it's a mimic. And there are a lot of HCM mimics with a different prognosis, different disease patterns. So in terms of research, I mean, these are the areas where we would be really looking at.
I think that's a really important area. And as people are going to see over the next 12 months, they're going to see a difference in the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association as well. And you were at the meeting when I questioned Dr. Barry Marin and Dr. Jeff Tobin about the term mimicker and who these mimickers are and what does it look like. And I asked at that point in time, is it now the time to move us to HCM spectrum disorders? And we're going to be moving forward with explanations of what these spectrum disorders are, how many of them have the same phenotype, but other features and characteristics that make the disease a little different in some groups of people. And I think we all have a lot to learn about where these phenocopies, mimickers, or spectrum disorders are and how to define them. So welcome back to our discussion. I'm sorry for the delay earlier, but Facebook went down. So I'm going to let everybody have a second to repopulate, and we can all, take a moment and laugh that during a live interview, Facebook decided to go offline. But we're back now. And we left off with an enticing question, and that was, tell us some of your favorite HCM stories. And we're going to hear them now.
Right. So I think I would choose two stories, and by far I think the first one is my favorite. See, when we started building the HCM unit or the HCM care establishment, we were already part of an international broadcasting feature called the Pan-African Movement. And often, probably once a month or once in 2 months, we would broadcast, sort of educational modules about HCM to 12 different universities in Africa. So this is something which the Indian government had entered into an MOU with the respective African governments. And we generated a lot of interest, in fact, amongst the universities and amongst the healthcare givers, in fact. So that was the first part. And, these broadcasts would go on, and we didn't find anything extraordinary in terms of the response it created, apart from some well-meaning questions and interactions. So our pediatric cardiology division usually gets a lot of patients from Ethiopia and Burundi. Especially, these are patients who come in for surgeries called mitral commissurotomies and complex congenital heart surgeries. And late last year, there's always this flight which lands in Kochi, through various connection routes from Ethiopia and Burundi. And this time around, there was something different about this flight. And we had a couple of patients with HCM in the flight. So it was quite surprising. So we had a patient from Burundi who needed a septal myectomy. We had a couple of patients who were diagnosed with HCM and sort of needed further evaluation and risk stratification. And we just felt absolutely vindicated. I mean, this came from nowhere. I mean, this came completely out of the blue. I mean, we had just broadcast a few talks, big deal, but the world is really a very small place, and our hearts felt immensely warmer when we saw this phenomenon. So that's my first story and my favorite story.
I'll pause you for a second after that story. So at the International Summit on HCM, I was sitting kind of to the front, but 3 rows back, and I had not heard you speak before. And I was entranced by the topic and how comprehensive your program in India was, and honestly, how superior it is to many areas of the United States when it comes to HCM care. And I was really impressed with the work. And then you brought up the children from Africa. And I started just so emotional that we've reached a point where the people with the least amount of access to healthcare services, one would argue African nations, are getting their children the care that they need and deserve for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I'm sniffling and wiping tears, and I hear a doctor behind me getting choked up, and we all just smiled after your talk. So thank you for that. Now let's hear your second story.
The second story, I think it's equally touching, and I think it's a very dear story to our hearts. So Southern Yemen, I think, as most of us are aware, is a war-ravaged country. So, I mean, there's no healthcare facility to speak of. And we received this email from Southern Yemen, and that's again through pediatric cardiology. It's an 8-year-old boy, and it's a school-going boy, and who's not been able to go to school, even walk to school, because of severe effort-related dyspnea. And he was diagnosed. So he managed to get an echo done. I mean, he traveled from southern Yemen, from the war-ravaged nation, to Saudi Arabia. And he got an echo done, and it showed severe obstructive HCM with resting gradients in excess of 90 millimeters of mercury. And they sent us an email and said, would you be able to help us? And the boy came in, and he went through the system of evaluation, and obviously he needed a septal myectomy. He got a myectomy done, and he went walking home. So this was a boy who was sort of limited to the wheelchair, and a boy with a very active and bright mind, but because of his symptoms, he was restricted to a wheelchair. And it was very heartening to all of us. I mean, he came in a wheelchair, went walking home from war-ravaged Yemen, and I mean, it doesn't get bigger than this in terms of where it touches the heart. Yeah.
And why we do what we do is to get those people to the services that they so desperately need. And I think in the United States, a little maybe cultural input here. I think in the United States, we miss out on the fact that a lot of people in parts of the world where access to healthcare resources is limited, that what we take for granted as, oh, I just needed a medicine or I just needed the surgery, are out of reach, and thereby perpetuate the cycle of poverty, because these people are stuck at home, they can't work, they can't take care of their families depending upon when they are afflicted. But because this young man got to you at age 8, he's now able to at least get an education and then potentially be able to support himself in the world and be an active and, you know, useful member of society. And I think it's fantastic that he was able to navigate himself there. And I'm actually a little curious. I want to go back in my records and look up, because I did have an inquiry from Yemen a few years ago, and I'm wondering if it might be the same child.
It might be the
it would not surprise me with the way our worlds are going. So it's just absolutely heartwarming that we're able to do this. From the American point of view, and we discussed this yesterday briefly, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the healthcare system works or does not work in India right now, and how patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy have to finance their healthcare.
Right. That's a very important question, and I think probably that's one of the fundamental questions that we face, I mean, every day in terms of managing healthcare. So I think to those uninitiated about the Indian healthcare system, the concept of healthcare insurance is in its infancy, and the practical reality that we face every day is that almost close to 95% of Indian patients have to pay for their healthcare out of their own pocket. So we're talking about a huge burden on financial resources of the respective families who would probably want to get systematic evaluation and proper healthcare delivery. The healthcare budget, in terms from the national perspective, I mean, it just and I'm very sad to say this, I mean, it just allocates only 1% of the GDP in terms of public funding for healthcare. So we are left with a situation where a typical HCM patient who needs a septal myectomy or an ICD, which are very expensive options in India, I mean, it's cheap as compared to the cost in the US, but relatively speaking, it's still very expensive. And for these patients, septal myectomy or ICD, they have to pay out of their own pocket. Yeah.
So we know the prices in the United States are pretty extreme when it comes to healthcare. It's based on, in most cases, this standard fee is based on your zip code and the location where you're having your surgery. And an average myectomy in the United States is in excess of $100,000. And an original implant of an ICD is probably in the $50,000 to $60,000 range, depending upon the number of leads utilized. Can you give us an idea in the standards that you're practicing in? What would these procedures cost in India?
Yeah, this is going to sound very strange to you. So if it's 100,000 for a septalmectomy in the US, it's $2,000 in India. Okay, so that's the ratio we're talking about. And for an ICD, it would be something very similar. I mean, it would be something close to $4,000, $5,000 in India for a nice single chamber ICD. So we're talking huge differences between the cost systems of both countries. But then having said that, if you look at the relative percentage of the income of the respective citizens in both of these countries, it would still remain expensive to a substantial proportion of Indian patients.
Right. So when we here in America are complaining about our healthcare system, we're a little bit ahead in some ways and awfully far behind in others. So I find it fascinating, the differences in healthcare delivery systems and access. And I do hope that we work, to help patients in your region be able to afford care. What does an echocardiogram cost, just out of curiosity?
Oh, it would cost something like 1,000 rupees. So that's something like $25. Yeah.
So getting screened isn't that difficult, but getting care
very easy, very easy. Yeah.
So the other thing that we discussed yesterday, and I do want to bring up because I think it's fascinating, there are big cultural differences in how people choose to manage a chronic genetic disorder. Are there any insights that you can give us as to the cultural differences in the Indian population on how they adjust to, live, communicate to families and employers about their condition?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think the cultural background plays a very big role in terms of how a patient or their family would deal with a potential genetic inherited disease, and the terms genetic and inheritance, especially in the Indian subcontinent, Indian context, has massive implications. And I think I would give you a very practical example. I mean, we had a family coming in with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a lot of members in the family being diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And there was this young lady who was diagnosed with HCM. And the question here was, when the family was counseled regarding the inheritance pattern and the potential implications of the disease, some of the questions meandered to, can she get married? And if she can get married, will she be able to have children? And if she does have children, what will the inheritance pattern be like? And see, in India, I think word gets around very fast in terms of marriage alliances when they're being discussed. So I later on came to know that this particular family had a very difficult time finding a partner, for their daughter, because word gets around there's something genetic going on in the family, and that has huge connotations within the Indian social structure. So I think the social structure here brings with it its own problems, I think, in addition to the actual scientific medical issues associated with this disease. Yes.
Well, I would say that my hope for your country in terms of HCM care and management is that care becomes more accessible, and the moniker of I have a genetic disease would be quickly followed by, but it is treatable and manageable, and that it would not become a stigma unto the family. And I think we're approaching that point from a scientific point of view. We just need to get there on a cultural point of view. And I think it's really important to discuss these things.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open up now to questions and answers. We did have this little interruption, so our online viewership live is a little smaller than usual today. But if anybody has any questions, we have an incredibly knowledgeable physician here. He just happens to live in another country, and we're catching him in the middle of the night, so no tricky questions. I will ask a question, while we're waiting for these questions to populate, which isn't really a scientific one. It's more of a mentorship one.
Mm-hmm.
Who are your heroes in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy research and science?
I think you're probably asking me the easiest question that you could have asked me. So I think a couple of years ago, I think serendipity actually played a big role in me meeting up with Dr. Barry Maron when he was at the Minneapolis Heart Institute. Now he's at Tufts in Boston. So without a question, I think it's Dr. Barry Maron and Dr. Martin Maron. I think they are and they will always be our heroes in terms of mentorship and who we look to emulate in terms of building a model for HCM care. And I have to admit that whatever we have achieved, I think he's had a considerably profound influence in our protocols and the way we've approached it. And short answer is absolutely yes. I think Dr. Maron has been one of the leading lights in this disease in the world, and he continues to be one for us. Will always continue to be for us.
And I understand he's visiting you next month too.
Yes, we're very excited about that. So he's coming to Mumbai. So it's a northern state in India. So I'm traveling to meet with him. We've got a couple of publications online. So we're just working on a couple of them. And I mean, all that apart, it just feels good to meet Dr. Maron anytime.
Well, you take good care of him over there, and don't forget to send him back home when you're done with them. We still need him over here too. Well, it doesn't look like there's any questions at this point. I do think Facebook is still being a little twitchy with some people, and I'm hoping that we don't have any glitches in this broadcast being published. And if we do, it would just be an excuse to have to talk to you again soon. So I will take it at that. So I want to thank you for your time today. And if patients around the world would like to get in touch with you, can you tell us how to do that? And I will tell you that we'll also get this up on the HCMA website in the next couple of weeks as well. But how do they find you?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to find us would be to log on to our institutional website. So that's the Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences and Research. I think the moment you Google it, it pops right up on top. And you just go to straight, there are subsections there. All you have to click is cardiology. The cardiology email will be right there in front of you. And just send us a message. I mean, there's a fax line, a telephone line, an email link. And I think, and if it's any patient who would like to contact me through the HCMA, I mean, Lisa, you're always there. My email ID is with you. They can contact me directly without going to the institution. Either way would work, and we'll have to help. And just before we end, I think, just as you mentioned, the mentorship of our program, I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize the fact that it's not just me who's in the system. I think there's a whole bunch of people right behind me and right with us, and we have functioned as a unit. It's never been about one person. And I think we've had all our senior consultants in the Department of Electrophysiology, heart failure transplant, cardiac imaging. We have a bunch of extremely good sonologists, and we have a couple of extremely well-committed physician assistants, and the entire Department of Cardiology. I think nothing would have been possible, what we've achieved in the last 3 years, without combined effort of all these people. And it's not about one person. I think it's about the entire team.
I couldn't agree more. And as I mentioned at the summit in October, we here at the HCMA are looking for the best practices going forward to recognize international programs. And I'm hoping as soon as we formalize that system, that your program will be one of the first we get to review to receive HCMA recognition as a center of excellence. So I'm looking forward to being able to send you an application and go through that process once we exactly figure out what the process is going to be. But I look forward to working with you on it. So thank you all for joining us today. Sorry about the glitches. When this gets uploaded to YouTube, we're going to try to combine the talk so it goes a little bit more smoothly. And if you do have any questions after this is published live, put your questions online and we will get back to you as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you and have a great day. And thank you, Doctor, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Lisa.